another of our talks about the wonder of God's creations. And this time it's about something we've all got, the amazing human ear. The ear is a very important organ in helping us to communicate with our surroundings. We didn't have them, as deaf people know to their cost. It's very difficult to know where you're going and to keep in touch with other people. How does the ear work? Well, if we think of a lion roaring behind us, we know it's time to run away, because sound moves from the mouth of the lion to our own ears, and we pick up the sound and say, quick, it's time to go. Or if we're small boys playing outside and mother comes to the door and says, come in for dinner, we know it's time to stop playing and go. Our ears are filled with the sound of her welcome voice. How does it work then? Well, sound travels from one place to another through vibrations of the air between. And so when we talk, or when we bang a drum, we actually make the air vibrate between us and the person who's listening at the other end. And inside our ear, what we call the outer ear, is a tiny round diaphragm, which is just like the top of a drum. It's almost made of a kind of drum skin. And it picks up these vibrations that have come across through the air from the source, whether it's a drumstick or whatever. And if you look at that in diagrammatic form, here's the man banging the drum, look, making the drum skin vibrate backwards and forwards. And that then sends pulses of sound through the air to our ear. When it reaches the diaphragm in our ear, that also moves backwards and forwards because it's picking up the vibrations from the drum. And you can find that in this diagram up here. There's the outer ear, the pinna. Here's the ear canal, and there's the diaphragm at the bottom of the canal. Sometimes it gets blocked up with wax, and we have to have the wax removed. Now, what's absolutely fascinating is that beyond that diaphragm in our ear, there is a tiny amplifier. Now, you know how it is with music or speech. If you're in a big hall and you want somebody to hear what you're saying, you have to have a microphone and an amplifier, which takes the electrical signals from the microphone and enlarges them and sends them out through loudspeakers, which then make the air vibrate as you're speaking much more loudly than just your plain voice. Well, the ear has an amplifier like that, but it's not electrical, doesn't need any power. It's actually carried out by 3 tiny bones, which are so assembled that they take the vibrations from the big diaphragm in the outer ear, and an increased movement passes through to a small membrane deep inside the ear. Let's have a look. There's the ear bones. There's the outer diaphragm that vibrates from the sound coming in. Here's a set of 3 little bones which are so positioned, so made, that as one moves a little bit, this one here moves a lot. This part we call the outer ear. This part here we call the mid-ear, where the bones are. And the last part, which I'll look at in a moment, that's the inner ear. Okay, so let's have a look at this mid-ear again. There's the diaphragm, and this little toe here is anchored to the diaphragm. When the diaphragm moves, that little toe moves backwards and forwards. And because this part here, the hammer, is suspended from the top of the, near the skull here, a small movement here is picked up here by a rotary movement that then compresses this part here called the anvil. And because the small movement up here on the anvil is then amplified by this long arm here, by leverage effectively, when that moves, it makes the stirrup bone here move backwards and forwards, and that's connected to another diaphragm, a small one, which is attached to the inner ear. So we have a mechanical amplifier. This diagram shows there's the outer diaphragm in the outer ear. There's the hammer bone suspended at the top. There's the anvil also suspended at the top, which rubs against the hammer bone, and down the bottom is the stirrup or stapes, which is anchored to the inner diaphragm. Now, there's the small vibration there, and it becomes a big vibration here after it's gone through the mechanical amplifier. Okay, what happens next? Well, we've now reached the small diaphragm on the inner ear, and on the other side of that diaphragm is a long tube, and this tube is filled with a very special fluid, not found anywhere else, but it's absolutely ideal for transmitting vibrations. And inside this tube, we have a long line of tiny hairs, each of which is anchored into a nerve cell. And when the diaphragm, the small diaphragm, begins to vibrate and the special fluid starts to shake backwards and forwards, these tiny hairs are moved backwards and forwards as well. So this fluid, ideal for transmitting a wave motion like this, is very special. Now those hairs are graded in length. They start off with fairly long ones. I mean, it's not microscopic, but still comparatively long. And they go down in size, smaller and smaller and smaller, till we get to the end of this tube. It's a bit like a ladder. And then to save space, instead of having a long tube, which would be difficult to get inside your head, the tube is wound round in a spiral, and we call that the cochlea. So here's the inner ear. There's that small diaphragm, look, we were talking about. And inside here is this tube, which is full of these tiny hairs, graduated from large to small. And then from this cochlea, every single one of those tiny hairs is sent by, it's connected by a nerve to the auditory department, the hearing department of the brain. So you'll notice too, in passing, we have a tube here that goes down to the throat from what we call the inner ear. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's pursue these tiny hairs. Okay, so as in diagrammatic form, that's the stirrup bone. There's the small diaphragm, small membrane, and here we have the long hairs. Start off with becoming shorter and shorter until they become very short at the far end. So it's a little bit like one of those ladders we used to use for climbing fruit trees, with long rungs at the beginning, shorter and shorter rungs at the end. Now, every single one of those hairs is tuned to a particular frequency. So, for example, if you were to press middle C on the piano, that's 256 vibrations per second, a particular hair would respond to that vibration because it's tuned to 256 vibrations per second. And that would send a message through to the brain saying, hey, brain, we're listening to a piano, and it's middle C has just been pressed. Okay, so that's absolutely fantastic. Of these tiny hairs, each one picks up a particular frequency, and they're all individually connected back to the brain. So if we hear with our outer ear a deep sound, like a church bell, bong, 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 that makes the long hairs vibrate because they're suitable for low frequencies. If we have a high-pitched sound, like the policeman's whistle or the referee's whistle, that makes the short hairs vibrate. I mean, we know that our brain tells us that we're listening to a high-pitched sound. Now listen, there are over 30,000 sensory hairs in that tube in your ear. 30,000. Each one is individually wired back to the auditory department in the brain. And somehow the brain assembles these incoming signals. If it's an orchestra that's playing, we can hear the timpani, we can hear the oboes, we can hear the violins. Somehow our ear sorts it all out and says, oh yes, all those different pitches make a beautiful sound. That's Beethoven's Third Symphony or whatever. Also, and this is even more interesting, because we've got two ears, our brain can calculate when the sound comes towards us from which side it's coming. Because those vibrations, if the sound's coming from our right-hand side, will hit our right ear microseconds before the sound gets round to our left ear. And the brain can say, oh yes, sound's definitely coming from the right, or above us, or below us, or to the left. Isn't that fantastic? So that's the story of the hairs in the ear. I'm sorry about the spelling mistake. That should be air pressure, of course. Let's have a look at this tube. As you've noticed earlier on, from the middle ear, there's a special tube that goes down into our throat. And that's rather essential to maintain our hearing. You see, if you were to climb a mountain, the pressure of the atmosphere will go down. And if that inner ear was sealed like a box, the pressure inside that box will stay the same. But the pressure from the outside of the diaphragm that's supposed to be vibrating will be much lower. And so the diaphragm will then bulge outwards to the low pressure, and you wouldn't hear anything. And conversely, if you were to go down a coal mine where the air pressure is much higher, then if that was a little sealed box, the middle ear was a sealed box, then the pressure in the sealed box will be higher than the pressure outside because you've gone down the mine. Sorry, no, one way around. It'd be higher outside because you've gone down the mine. And then the diaphragm in the outer ear would bulge inwards like that, so tight, you wouldn't be able to hear anything. So we have this tube. It's called the eustachian tube that stops the outer diaphragm from being stretched taut in these unusual situations on top of a mountain or deep in the earth. Let's have a look at it again. So there's the outer diaphragm, bottom of the ear canal. There's the three bones, and this is the tube here. We call it the eustachian tube, and it goes down into our throat. So if we climb up a mountain and the air pressure drops, instead of this pressure here staying the same, it allows the pressure inside here to escape through this tube into our throat. So eventually the pressure in the inner tube, in the ear, and the pressure outside in the mountain air is the same. And then our diaphragm can vibrate normally. Conversely, go down the mountain, down the coal mine, pressure rises. We need to get that pressure away from this tube, this area here, through the tube, to allow the diaphragm to vibrate normally. So we have a built-in protection to allow for where we are on the surface of the earth, high up or low down. But the thing I find most fascinating of all about the human ear is the way in which we are protected from loud noises. Now, for example, if we had the sound of thunder close up overhead, say, it would move that outer diaphragm quite vigorously, and because of the amplification, it would move the inner ear membrane very much so. And the poor little hairs in that tube beyond will get shaken to pieces. They would actually be damaged. So those delicate hairs have to be protected. How is this done? Well, those three little ear bones are fitted out with very special tiny muscles, we could call them damper muscles, which when there is a loud sound coming into the outer ear, it tells the brain there's a lot of loud sound coming and do something. The brain sends a signal to those tiny damper muscles, and they become shorter, and by contracting, they increase the pressure on those little bones and stop them vibrating. And that happens within a few milliseconds. The moment the thunder or the gunshot, whatever it is, the drum beat starts, bang, already those little muscles are contracted and our ear bones are protected. Let's have a look again at the diagram. So there's the outer ear diaphragm, the bottom of our ear canal. Here's the three bones, and here's the stapes connected to the small diaphragm from where the tube goes with all those hairs in. Okay, now suspended from the roof of your skull is a muscle which is anchored to the skull up there, top of your throat, that sort of thing, and the other end is attached to this bone here, the stirrup bone, the anvil bone. Now, when the loud sound begins, this muscle contracts and it pulls taut on this bone here and stops it vibrating. At the same time, another much smaller muscle, completely separate, also attached to the skull, sends a signal sent to it from the brain saying, quick, contract. And as it contracts, it pulls taut that stapes bone so that it can't vibrate. And so it protects this little diaphragm here from damage. And all that happens in a fraction of a second like that. As the sound begins to build up, our ears are automatically protected from damage by those two special muscles. I've drawn them now. As they're contracting, they get thicker, and they're pulling taut onto those two special ear bones. Okay? Now, some questions, folks. Some questions. If evolution was true, how could these wonderful devices arrive in the ear by a series of chance mutations without anybody to direct them or design them? That's my big question. Can you imagine somehow, without any outside designer, those three tiny bones come together across the mid-ear to link the outer diaphragm to the inner one and to amplify the sound. How do those three bones come to be exactly positioned like that and at the right shapes to be able to, by leverage, increase the movement of the stapes and increase the sound we hear? I think that's fantastic. But even more fantastic is the question of how those 30,000 hairs assemble themselves in a long line, graded continuously from long down to short, in this unique fluid. Each individual cell or hair is linked into the brain. And that somehow allows the brain to build up a picture of what you're listening to and where it's coming from. Those vibrating hairs are tuned to just one particular frequency. I think that's amazing. And then that noise dampening muscle that we just looked at just then. Did millions of people lose their hearing, or other animals lose their hearing, before this mechanism developed? Did the very first burst of thunder make the first person or animal with this system deaf forever? How can you get muscles dropping down from inside the body, the skull cavity, to a particular bone floating about, so to speak, in that inner ear, and then a signal coming through from the brain to tighten that muscle in a fraction of a second, a few milliseconds, to make sure our precious hairs in our ear are not damaged from very loud sound. And even that tube that goes down into your throat and allows you to balance up the pressure when you go up in your aeroplane or come down in your aeroplane, you gulp, 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 and eventually you can hear perfectly again. I think that's all very fantastic. In fact, so fantastic, it demands a very clever person who thought that all through and put everything in place. And that's what the Bible says. This is Proverbs chapter 20, verse 12. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. Now the Lord, says the Bible, made the hearing ear. Here's another verse, Isaiah 45. God speaking, I've made the earth. I've created man upon it. My hands have stretched out the heavens, and all their hosts have I commanded. That's the God, the great God, up there in the heavens, who made all the things that we see around us, all those beautiful trees and plants and flowers and animals and birds and fishes, and even the microbes down in the earth that are so essential to recycling. Let's give praise and thanks then to this mighty God who made us in the first place.